What we got here is a case of a person that went into a complete and slow descent into insanity. So at first he was already acting very out of line with strange behavior, breaking the law, doing crazy shit, even being sentenced to death already. But at the time Abraham Lincoln actually took pity on him and pardoned his sentence. But then ultimately he started actually murdering people anyway. Totally innocent people as well, even a child. Maybe multiple ones, but it eventually ends with a murder of a child. So today I'm going to narrate the wiki information, because one Google search showed me some websites that condensed the information from Wikipedia, but there seems to be no sketch or any visual element to who this perpetrator actually was, what he looked like. So that's why it will be lacking throughout the whole narration. But other than that, I'll be sharing the details with you, so I hope you're ready. As they started this article out, it said the following. Thomas David Carr was an American thief, arsonist, murderer, and self-confessed serial killer. He was hanged in 1870 for murdering 13-year-old Louisa Fox in Kirkwood Township, Belmont County, Ohio. And shortly before his execution, he confessed to murdering 14 men, including to participating in a famous 1867 murder that occurred in West Virginia. Now, they have some information here concerning his upbringing and military service, and then instantly it goes straight into the murders themselves that ultimately got him the death penalty, and this time there would be no pardon. Now, Thomas Carr was born on March 6th, 1847, as the fourth son in a family of 5 boys and 3 girls. His father, William Carr, had been an abusive parent who treated him harshly throughout his childhood. 3 years after his birth, his family began moving frequently around West Virginia, living in Woods Run, Fulton, Center Wheeling, and settling in North Wheeling. He grew up a troublesome child who frequently fought with other kids in the street. He formed bad associations, and when he began work, he did jobs for rivermen, brickyard hands, and colliers. In 1854, he was sentenced to prison for unknown reasons. He claimed that he was intimate friends with a John H. Burns and his accomplice Oscar Myers, who had murdered a woman named Mary Montoni. Burns had been sentenced to death while Myers still life imprisonment. While on a visit to the prison, Carr had slipped poison for Burns to kill himself with, but the man was too cowardly to do it. Shortly after, his family moved again, this time to Belmont County in Ohio. Not long after, the now 16-year-old Carr was enlisted with the 16th Ohio Infantry and served 3 months in West Virginia. On the picture I have something here that was on Wikipedia as well that seems to represent what these people looked like, so it's not specifically him. I just wanted to point it out because they went on to say that following this, he enlisted for 3 years in the 18th Ohio Infantry. So we have a different picture here, but again, it doesn't portray him specifically in it. Now, when that term expired, he enlisted to another division yet again. During his military career, he was frequently arrested due to misconduct, and twice sentenced to be shot for violating regulations. On one such occasion, he was forced to dig his own grave. Then President Abraham Lincoln felt pity on the boy and pardoned his sentence. So he was lucky, I guess, at that time, but not so much after this, because now he really went crazy. The first murder Carr confessed to took place near Virginia's Greenleaf Mountain. He had wandered away from his regiment so he could drink. While laying about in the woods, a citizen had tried to arrest him. As the man approached, he took out his gun and shot him in the left breast before fleeing. The next day, the man died from his injuries. Shortly after, while a prisoner in Columbia, South Carolina, Carr had learned that a man named Edward Beringer was attempting to join the Confederate States Army, along with 2 comrades from the 14th Ohio Infantry. The trio strangled Beringer. After his release, he rejoined the 18th Ohio Infantry and was discharged to Mississippi, where he shot 2 rebel soldiers, one of them while on picket duty. When his time expired in the 18th Regulars, he turned towards the 4th Ohio Infantry, serving his duty without much trouble, except once, when he shot at Annie Whalen in Clarksburg, a prostitute whom he had connections to. Enlisting afterwards in the 180 Ohio Infantry, He was serving in Belmont County when he was allegedly prevented from arresting a deserter by a Dr. L. Voorhees. Voorhees claimed this never happened. While fighting in the Battle of Franklin, Carr claimed that he had killed and then robbed 2 men. Following this, he fought in the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, at a place called Wise's Forks, where he crouched behind a pine log and killed an unaware rebel sergeant who had just passed by. He pilfered the man's clothes afterwards. His next murder was that of a soldier of the 84th Ohio Infantry, whom Carr had been placed to guard, and then killed after the man had tried to escape. He also claimed that he was one of a gang of 11 men who raided a sutler's shop in Petersburg, Virginia, stamping the owner to death in the process. While near Raleigh, North Carolina, a gang of 15 soldiers, including Carr, had learned that a Federal soldier had been hung by the Confederates in the cellar of the house of a prominent Southerner. When they arrived at the house, they found a rich planter's residence. Soldiers burned down the house, watching the woman flee the burning residence. One of them, a beautiful 17-year-old girl, had her dress burning from the fire, but was extinguished by the man. However, they then gang raped and tortured the girl in a brutal way, leaving her for dead in a nearby orchard without any assistance. When he learned of the crime the following day, Carr said that the man that done that ought to be hung. After this, Carr was guarding a house in Raleigh when he shot a man who was trying to break inside. He had also thrown a colored waiter who refused to give him any food overboard while on a steamer traveling from Morehead City to Fort Monroe. While in Baltimore, Maryland, he attempted to ride on a streetcar without paying a fare. The conductor noticed this and, while trying to kick him off, had one of his ears nearly severed by the freeloader. The driver then tried to help his colleague, but was stabbed in the bowels by Carr and died soon after. The killer then mingled with the crowd and shaved his mustache afterwards, successfully escaping. In Newark, Ohio, after finishing a bottle of whiskey, Carr threw it, hitting a random stranger who was then standing on the platform, splitting the man's skull open. Just at that moment, a train full of soldiers was passing by and Carr jumped on, escaping justice once again. And this is gonna keep going. I just want to warn you, all this crazy shit in this man's supposed serial killing career won't end here. You see, we have to remember it was also self-confessed serial killing. Now, of course, he was convicted of certain murders for real, but some of the stories are still taken with a grain of salt, where it's like, was he really the perpetrator? Did he really do all this? Perhaps he never did, and it's just all a bunch of wild stories. Anyways, they went on to write the following. After returning to Wheeling, following his army service, Carr began working again, first for a man named James Sweeney in a brickyard, then for a James Bodley, whom he worked for until May 1867. One night he escaped from work. Early the following morning, while strolling around town, Carr met a Swiss traveler by the name of Joseph, and his last name I can't pronounce. The man had just arrived from Parkersburg on a steamboat named Express, and had left his baggage on the boat. Now Joseph told Carr that he wanted him to help kill his companion, a fellow Swiss named Alois Ulrich. While the trio were traveling along the Hempfield Railroad, Joseph got behind Ulrich and struck him with a hatchet. The same hatchet Joseph would later use for murdering another man in Parkersburg. Carr, who was afraid to be next to the victim, struck Ulrich with a rock, and then Joseph finished him off with the hatchet. After killing him, the duo rummaged through his pocket, finding a lot of francs and some paper money. They divided the money, with Carr getting the bigger share, and parted ways. And Carr would later claim that he'd seen Joseph in Pemberton House, where he was having the time of his life. Following this murder, he felt very uneasy, even considering giving himself up, since Carr was afraid that after the coroner's inquest, Joseph would implicate him. However, that never happened, and he never saw Joseph again. Following this, Carr considered peddling the money, but this murder began haunting him, and so he decided to join the church, headed by Reverend Ball. For some time he felt better, with people encouraging him. Despite this, he soon grew restless and began talking in his sleep due to fear of being found out. He decided to leave Wheeling and to never return. He moved back to Belmont County, where he was to be engaged to a 13-year-old girl named Louisa Catherine Fox, and Suessville. He initially claimed to have her parents' consent, but they later had retracted it and refused to let the girl marry him. When Louisa told him that she had to break off the marriage, this infuriated Thomas, who then decided that he'd kill her. He stole a razor from the shoe shop of an Alexander Williams and turned towards the house of a Mrs. Hunter, for whom Fox was working as a servant girl. He lied to the girl that he had been to her parents' house and that they wanted her to visit them to their grandparents. He then asked Louisa one last time, and she rejected him yet again. Following this, Carr drank around 4 bottles of hard cider, which heavily intoxicated him. Learning that Fox was going to her grandparents, he got the stolen razor and went on to the road, deciding to wait by a large oak tree. He changed his mind and decided to get a gun and shoot Fox. He visited 2 separate houses to ask for one, but neither had a gun. After returning to the fields, Carr noticed some tracks and immediately realized they were from Louisa. He then ran up the hill and waited till he saw her walking along the road with her little brother Willie. Carr hid behind a fence before Louisa herself noticed him and began talking to him. The pair conversed for a long while, both of them eventually breaking down into tears. Louisa kept telling him that they couldn't get married due to her parents' disapproval. Carr then told Willie to go down the road and that they would follow him soon after. After arguing for a bit, both began walking down the road, with Willie being about 10 yards ahead of them. By then, Carr decided to kill her when they reached the ravine, continuing their talk in the meantime. He asked her if it was enough for a man to commit a crime, with her crying out that she wished for death due to all the problems she was facing. Upon hearing this, Carr grabbed her by the arm and began walking towards the ravine, asking her if she was ready to die. The girl pleaded for her life, but to no avail. When he reached the gutter, he pulled out the stolen razor and began slashing the right side of her neck across the jugular vein, making a wound that was 10 inches long and 2 inches deep. Fox's last words were supposedly, "Farewell, Tom. Oh, I didn't think you could serve me so." He then proceeded to make between 10 or 12 more cuts on her neck, one on the hand and final on the breast. After letting some of her blood spill in the gutter, he raised the now deceased Louisa and kissed her 3 times. After leaving the body, Carr started going up the hill, considering cutting his throat near a white oak tree, but then decided to go back in Sewellsville with a gun and kill Mrs. Hunter. He saw that he was being chased due to the fact that Willie had informed his father of the deed. Carr began knocking on every door he came across, asking the owners politely if they had any guns so he could kill a rabbit, before finally arriving at the house of a Mr. Young, whose wife finally gave Thomas a gun. After arming himself, cut through the woods and began walking the same road on which he had followed Louisa, feeling weakened and walking slowly as he had not eaten anything. He then saw a group of people surrounding the murder site and looking for him. He noticed that a lot of people were coming in and out from the Fox residence and decided to take a look. After passing by several of the posse, cocking his gun and preparing to shoot at any time, Carr got lucky and each of them passed by him. When he finally got to the kitchen window, he saw Louisa's body being dressed up by the doctors. He immediately felt that he should kiss her and shake her hand, but had to wait as there were still people inside. Continuing to observe the people entering and leaving, he saw Louisa's body, remarking that she was looking very pale, but thought hers was the most beautiful corpse he ever saw. However, despite feeling utterly miserable, he decided to hide away in the nearby bank until the morning. Around dawn of the following day, he came out of the bank and returned to his hiding place, deciding to observe for a while. He contemplated going back to the house and seeing Louisa's body again, but was afraid that there would be too big of a crowd and that they would see him. So instead, he decided to get his handkerchief and tie up his gun, placing it on a rafter and putting the muzzle to his heart. He then arranged a string that, when pulled, would pull the gun toward him and kill him instantly. He jerked his hand and the bullet was lodged into his breast, to the left of his heart. He fell on his back and began checking if the bullet had come out of him or not, which it hadn't. After this, he got up and walked over to the spring, 30 to 40 yards from there, and had a drink. Soon after, he heard somebody, the Foxes, screaming, "Murder!" And immediately upon hearing this, Carr grabbed the stolen razor and began cutting his throat, before jabbing it straight into his windpipe, almost severing it completely. Due to how fast the blood was flowing, he fainted. He survived, however, and was immediately taken to court. In June 1869, he was tried and found guilty of murdering Louisa Fox, being sentenced to death for the crime. His lawyer lodged an appeal, and during this time, Carr tried to kill himself again by cutting one of his veins open. On the day of his execution, Carr was ready to die. While waiting in his cell, he was visited by two girls who were fascinated with him. He gave them a photograph and some silver rings and asked them to remember him, which they promised they would do. After being put on the scaffold, he began saying prayers and singing hymns, asking for God to receive him after he dies. He then made a long speech, telling his life story and how he was harshly disciplined as a child, and that the future generations should not be like him. He blamed most of his confessed murders on his heavy drinking, saying the following: "The bitter cup they call whiskey has brought me here. It will ruin any man. Whiskey is what brought me where I now stand, a condemned murderer about to be launched into eternity. Take my advice and banish it. Banish whiskey and you banish crime. Look at your prisons, look at your poor. Look at the gallows erected here to hang me, a soldier who fought 5 years to defend the government. Keep liquor away from your citizens. Banish whiskey and you will have no more wicked men like Tom Carr to execute. I pray earnestly that God will break up the dram shops. Pray for it, everyone." After finishing with a short prayer for the many crimes in his life, the trapdoor was opened. His neck wasn't immediately broken, but he slowly strangled and soon died. After physicians pronounced him dead, his body was buried in the local pauper's lot in St. Clairsville. His execution was the first legal execution ever carried out in the county. And that is pretty much the end of this article. And what a story it is. It almost sounds like a story for a movie. If all of this were 100% accurate, this guy lived quite a wild life as a murderer. Going from army regiment to regiment, different places throughout the United States, still ending up a complete nut job. But according to him, it was all because of the whiskey. Which is always a nice excuse, but it is true, drugs can make you absolutely crazy. That's why it can be dangerous. But at the end of the day, if you know that drugs makes you capable of murder, then you should not take the drugs any longer. If you really cared about humanity, you would not have done it. So it just sounds like a stupid, pathetic excuse in the end. Anyways, I hope his victims are resting in peace, and I hope he found peace as well after living such a crazy life back in the day. And with that being said, dear viewer, have sweet dreams.